So next up, we have one of the creators of Kubernetes, co-founder of Heptio and vice president of R&D here at VMware. Please welcome to the stage, Craig McLuckie.
Hi, folks, and thanks so much for having me on. It's really exciting to have an opportunity to share some thoughts with you on a topic that I think of, I'm really sort of fascinated by, which is this journey towards cloud native. And it really speaks to a lot of the transformations that we're seeing across the IT industry, both in the private and the public sector. And so what I'd like to do is just to provide some perspective on this, through the lens of my own personal journey towards technologies like the introduction of Kubernetes, the introduction of the Tanzu portfolio, and snap it back to a set of things that I think are really relevant to organizations as they're navigating this journey themselves. Just provide a little bit of input into how that's shaping up and where it's all going. And so to start this off, I think it's kind of interesting to take a moment to reflect on the public cloud as a sort of what it really represents to organizations. And from my perspective, at least, I've joined this whole kind of journey towards public cloud with the introduction of Google Compute Engine. So I was working within the apparatus of Google and looking to bring relatively traditional enterprise-grade workloads to organizations at scale. And this was a fascinating project. This opportunity to really benefit from those economies of scale, being able to have access to this vast untapped pool of physical resources, to be able to start standing up these set of services that could be consumed at the back of an API call. But it was also an interesting exercise because when you're building a public cloud service and you don't yet have all of the workloads that you want to run in the public cloud service, you really have to kind of look at what options are available to you. And one of the things that became clear to me, at least, as I was building our compute engine with my friend Joe Beta, was that while cloud certainly drives those economies of scale, lets you buy that 10,000th VM for a lower price than you would pay potentially for the 10th VM, it doesn't necessarily solve this other problem, which is the economies of scope associated with the environment. What I mean by that is the economies of scope philosophy is, sorry, I think I'm having a little bit of trouble here with my presentation mode. I'm a little bit of a newbie to Teams. Hope this is coming through now. Is that good? So when we think about economies of scope, what that really represents is a way to normalize your operating model. So if you think about this from an economics perspective, okay, you've got the economies of scale. I buy 10,000 widgets and the 10,000th widget costs less than the 100th widget. Economies of scope are, if I buy metric widgets only instead of metric and imperial, I buy metric screwdrivers and bolts and wrenches and all the tools that go with it. And so interestingly, when I think about these two disruptive waves, they're very complementary. Kubernetes was always intended to provide those economies of scope, making those environments as consistent as possible, whether they're on premises or in the public cloud. Certainly, while I was sort of initiating the project, that was a big motivating factor, just normalizing that so that more of those workloads could run on the public cloud capabilities that we'd been introduced. That it also opened up this fascinating opportunity to really start looking at what that means from a sort of fundamentally disruptive perspective. And one of the things that I don't think folks have fully internalized about Kubernetes at this point is that it's a much more fundamental change than just a container orchestration technology. It's also a way to change IT itself, to change the way that you think about accessing and consuming those technologies. It brings a lot of what made cloud great in terms of having that kind of API-centric way to access and consume a resource and make sure that resource is deployed. But it also represents this really novel path forwards. Because if you think about IT today, if you think about the way that a lot of traditional IT teams are run, it's very much an operator-driven system. You file a ticket, and then an operator participates in some set of actions, and then you get a result at the back end of it. And now what Kubernetes is really doing is moving from an operator-driven system to an intent-driven system, which means that everything you want to do is behind an API call, but it's not just a procedural API saying do this, then do that, then do this thing, then do the next thing, right? Like with Kubernetes, for instance, if you want to run 6 pods, you say, hey, run 6 pods. If the system sees there's 0 pods running, it'll schedule 6. If it sees there's 7, it'll actually remove one and get you to a 6. So you provide a statement of intent, and then these smart controllers are there to drive your desired system, the software system, into the state that you specify. And that represents a really powerful motion forwards, because you're now getting to a point where you have this API surface area, you're able to use an expression of intent, and then rely on these autonomous systems to actually drive your IT state into that desired shape. And I like to kind of draw the analogy between a traditional biplane, as I showed in the previous picture, and the modern drone. The modern drone is by and large an intent-driven system. Behind the scenes, there's some really intelligent controllers that are making moment-to-moment decisions around propeller velocity, etc. And the operator model is really about providing expression of intent to the drone so that the drone fulfills that set of outcomes. Like, why not apply that to modern IT? Why shouldn't everything we be doing, be applied this way? And what's really fascinating about the Kubernetes project, and this is something that, it's interesting because when I initially, spoke to my friend Brennan Burns, who was a robotics professor, who was also one of the founders of the Kubernetes project, he introduced this idea of a custom resource definition, effectively a way for someone else to program the Kubernetes control plane. And I thought it was a terrible idea. I was like, Brennan, you're crazy. Like, this is going to just create chaos. But what it actually created was a fundamentally new paradigm whereby anyone could start to describe what their application should look like, what their system should look like, and rely on something like Kubernetes to drive the world into that desired shape. And that's paying dividends well beyond the boundaries of Kubernetes itself. If you actually look at the work that we, VMware, have been doing in the upstream Kubernetes community through things like Cluster API, we asked the question, well, like, what would a perfect system look like to drive your infrastructure into a perfect Kubernetes cluster? How could you construct a system so that the upgrade mechanics is just providing an updated version string to this intelligent system that has all of these nested controllers inside it? And this pattern is really redefining the way that people think about delivering software, delivering outcomes, managing operations, et cetera. And it's really baked into everything we do inside the Tanzu portfolio. Now, one of the kind of interesting questions that I get asked a lot is, like, when I think about this new system for Kubernetes, is that a platform for modern applications, or is that a modern application platform? Meaning, is it a modern app platform, something where I can run pretty much any application on? And the answer is like, why not both, right? And I think something that's really interesting here is starting to think through, what does that continuum look like for modern applications? A lot of organizations have already walked down the road of saying, hey, this is really great for my my new greenfield applications. It's great for stateless web applications, etc. Increasingly, there are opportunities to look at this as a way to enrich and improve the portfolio of existing applications you have. Now, that doesn't mean doing a complete redo of your application. Like, the answer almost never is like, hey, take that monolith, factor it into 27 microservices, and life is great. There's going to be a continuum, and there's a set of steps that you can take. And if you understand what those steps are, you can start to really reap the benefits of these types of technologies. My friend James Waters always likes to describe the one-factor application, which is kind of the first step forwards. Will this thing restart itself in production if it goes down? And being able to take something that's relatively monolithic and at least layer that in creates a positive step forwards. And so as you're starting to assess these technologies, it's really important to see this as a continuum, to see the ROI associated with each steps along that road. Now, one of the things that I think is incredibly important, and I always joke, I'm sick and tired of talking about Kubernetes. I've been talking about it since the inception, and I'm only half joking about that. The reality is, with this class of system, it's a beautiful, powerful system to build these distributed applications. There's certain classes of developers that work within your organizations that it's going to speak to. It's like a love letter to those distributed systems developers. But it's also important to recognize that there are other abstractions that create value. And most developers, when they first encounter a system like Kubernetes, are going to have a bit of a learning curve. And one of the things that I think is really important as you're thinking through your strategy is to recognize the value of highest abstraction first, other abstractions are possible. And this goes back right to the beginning of the journey that we went on with Kubernetes. It was really interesting to see that at the time there were technologies like Google App Engine or Heroku that provided that PaaS experience, but they were closed systems. And then at the other end, you had virtual machines and all of the orchestration technologies associated with that, or the app management technologies like Puppet Chef, Ansible, Salt, etc. And there was no real commonality between the two of them. And once you reach the end boundaries of those higher abstractions, you had to fall all the way down into this much lower abstraction, and it created a lot of friction. So in many ways, Kubernetes was intended as that sort of intermediate step, that sweet spot, that what I like to call the Goldilocks abstraction. Low enough level to run pretty much anything, high enough level to hide away the specifics of the infrastructure. But it still hasn't necessarily solved for that need that developers have, because not every developer is going home, after a long day work and then sitting on Hacker News and, following the latest trends in open source technologies and pushing pull requests and all that type of thing. A lot of them want to just go home and, watch a little bit of ESPN and hang out with their family. And so making sure that those higher abstractions are available to you, but you have the option to kind of fall down to a lower layer without having to break everything to do that is really important. So when you break glass, you should be able to. It should be a deliberate decision, but it shouldn't invalidate the set of abstractions that you're using within your organization. Now, as we kind of move forwards, through this IT landscape, increasingly we talk a lot about APIs, microservices, these more intrinsically decoupled systems. And in many ways, technologies like Kubernetes has really unlocked that for enterprises at every scale of operations. Those technologies are now effectively becoming a mainstay. You've got these capabilities that enable you to start to deliver and serve these kind of microservice-based units. It's also important not to look at just the capabilities and the needs of microservices. There's both pros and cons to this. Like the pro is that this is now emerging as a unit of collaboration. This is emerging as something that you can take to your teams and say, hey, you can now create something that has far more intrinsic reusability across a broad array of contexts. You can start small, saying, okay, well, we're just going to make this something that is used by this team, and we're going to create a better factored application. But you also have the opportunity to start looking at that as something that can then be offered as a service to adjacent teams. So it's a way to really drive those operating efficiencies with an organization. And there's a lot of different steps on that continuum as well towards creating these microservice-based outcomes. But it's also important to recognize the flip side of that equation. As you start to engage with these types of systems, as you start to build these more intrinsically decoupled applications, it also introduces some challenges. How do I think about dependency management? What does application performance management look like in these highly distributed systems? How do I debug something where the call chain goes through all of these other areas? And so I'm incredibly bullish about this. I think there's some really cool innovation happening in the ecosystem right now as we start looking at the formalization of an API, something that can actually be embedded in your application, as something that your developers can have direct access to, versus starting to think about APIs, or the way we used to think about APIs as an industry, where you'd have an API reverse proxy that you could then configure and use as a control point. Bringing that to the teams, but then complementing them with the tools they need to be able to do that at scale, to be able to start discovering and consuming and rendering out those capabilities across the broader organization, but also dealing with the day-to operational challenges that naturally emerge as these systems become more complex is incredibly important. So definitely do take the time to think about that as you're building out your programs and walking this journey. Now, where all of this leads is to something that I think is incredibly powerful. I talked a little bit about this idea of intent-driven controller reconciler-based systems, right? And we are now in a position where well thought out, well put together teams are able to start treating their applications that way. They're able to start thinking about their application as something that has those as a service properties that can be generated in any environment that they're operating in. It can be generated in an environment that's on premises. It can be generated in an environment that's completely firewalled off from the outside world. And in place of the operator, you now put all of that logic into these intelligent controllers. So it creates an opportunity to start to really think about the delivery of your software as a service, putting the as a service experience in pretty much any technology, whether that's infrastructure technologies like Kubernetes, where we put an as a service experience in the deployment, update, and management of Kubernetes clusters, whether it's the technologies that run on top of that. So it could be something like a Knative technology that I'll talk about in a minute. There's this amazing opportunity to start really thinking through this. But the big challenges I see, the biggest inhibitors to organizations being able to make this journey, to generate the ROIs associated with the skills. It's obviously going to take a while before those skills fully permeate an organization. Making those technologies and capabilities more intrinsically accessible is another critical part of this. So making sure you have those higher abstractions so that you're not necessarily exposing all of the ooky details to your developers that are relatively early on this journey. And then finally, a lot of this is also about inertia, like organizational inertia is real. When an organization starts to encounter some of these new disruptive patterns, it takes a while for the regulatory sort of position, the perspective from a security perspective, et cetera, to catch up. And so it just makes sense to have a partner that you can work with, down this journey. Make sure that you can get those skills in there, that can create those centers of excellence, can start to really see the benefits of these patterns. And make sure that as you're making these investments, you're not walking down a dead end that you can't back out of. So no one-way doors on this journey if you can avoid them. Now, I'm often asked, like, okay, what, Craig, are you really excited about, right? When you look to the next, couple years, what are the set of things that you see happening in this space that are going to be fundamentally disruptive, that are really going to change the landscape further? And there's a few things that I think are just amazing. One is we're really starting to see the sort of emergence of what was historically, traditional middleware being kind of spun to the poles. It's been happening for years with technologies like Spring. Now, with the advent of Kubernetes, we see this amazing opportunity to bring those two worlds together. What made a technology like Spring as a runtime great? Well, Spring Boot made it great. It was fundamentally decoupled from the environment. You could, externalize a lot of those dependencies. What does that look like from a polyglot perspective? Like, how do you make that available to any language runtime? How do you make it so that you can bind any service into this environment? And that's an area that, I'm certainly interested in, and I'm excited to see additional investments, certainly through the lens of VMware in that particular area. I think that the area of container build and deployment is becoming increasingly important. Obviously, we talk a lot about DevSecOps. We talk a lot about the sort of shift left, being able to offer up the super highway from a developer's IDE into a production environment. Recognizing that highway is going to have interchanges, that different teams are going to have different needs, expectations. They may already have a set of significant investments in this space. And being able to structure that highway effectively as a workflow control plane, or like being able to really think through that developer workflow in a first-class way is going to be really important. This is one of the things that I think Cloud Foundry did well. And we now have this amazing opportunity to not only enrich that capability for Cloud Foundry's sake, but to start bringing that into the Kubernetes ecosystem in a much more sustainable and constructive way. Content matters. This matters no matter what industry that you're in right now. We do see this increasing concern and a lot of sensitivity around, what is the source of the content that I'm putting into production? How do I make sure that as my developers start to engage with these technologies, they have the content they need, the libraries, the container images, whatever the case may be. But how do I make sure that they're sufficiently curated so that when organizations are, tying the developers loose, allowing them to actually start building these systems, they can be updated. If there's a supply chain exploit that's crept into the system, you can immediately find where that content is running, address it deterministically, and have all of the controls that you need to have in place. And so that's exciting. I already talked a little bit about APIs. I'm so excited about it. It warranted its own slide. And that's obviously an area that we're making considerable investments in to really rethink the API landscape through the lens of the development teams that are actually producing these services, thinking about the mechanics of what does it take to get to a legitimate API economy. And there's, again, an opportunity here to move the needle forwards. But it's not just about the APIs. There's a whole bunch of other things that are starting to show up in the context of public cloud that are really crying out for those economies of scope opportunities that I talked about earlier. Being able to bring Lambda-like computing to an environment of your choice, being able to offer that up in an environment which is, sitting in a completely isolated context, potentially having, periscoping behaviors, I like to say it, where something may be partially connected from time to time, and just making sure that as you're starting to build those capabilities, you have that local control plane, you have the ability to, deploy these types of functions, sort of functions-based computing into any environment. So like some of the work that we're doing through the lens of the Knative community, some of the work we're doing to really up-level that experience and create that whole cloth experience for building functions as a service is really fascinating to me. And then finally, obviously, as part of the VMware portfolio, we're known for Cloud Foundry. We're continuing to invest heavily in Cloud Foundry. In fact, over the last year, I'm so proud of the work the team has done to continue to up-level and strengthen the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, which I see as a very natural complement to a lot of what we're doing in the Kubernetes ecosystem. We want to carry that forwards. We want to make sure that that's available to organizations in any environment. But increasingly, we also recognize the need that much of what you build from a PaaS perspective has to be domain specific. You really want to be able to complement that with a set of services that you need to create the outcomes that you need from a business perspective. And so at the end of the day, wrapping all of this up, it's really about the outcomes that we're driving. It's really about providing these technologies in a way to teams that's accessible to the team depending on where they are in their moment-to-moment journey towards these cloud-native based outcomes. And so, for me personally, like the thing that I have found most enlivening about my personal journey over the last 7 years since we introduced Kubernetes, it's been that opportunity to walk the journey with organizations. And so again, it all comes back to that skills, like having the opportunity to meet organizations where they are, to take the next step forwards with them, to really think about this as a collaborative partnership through the lens of the open source community, through the lens of the engagements that we participate in with organizations. And so it's been a wonderful journey so far. I'm so excited about what's coming next. I think it's really going to redefine the way that organizations think about delivering high quality services and outcomes to their customers. And I'm just excited to be a part of it. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate having the opportunity to address you. And with that, I'll hand it back.
Thank you so much, Craig. In the end, it's all about the outcome.